Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Cole. We're going to try out a new thing in class I'll record some of my lectures instead of doing them in class. You will listen to them at home. So this first one is just kind of a test to see how it works. This is my first time doing it, so I apologize if the volume is very loud or it's too quiet or if there's other technical issues. I'm still working this out as well. So as we talked about in class yesterday, we have begun with the progressive era. What the progressives are is they're a group of people who attempt to fix the negative problems of American society that has been caused by industrialization, by big businesses, by political corruption, by immigration. All these problems that we talked about the last couple of weeks, the progressives are trying to fix it. So what we did in class today was talk about the four big categories of reforms. Again, reforms mean a change, okay? So these are major categories of changes that the progressives wanted to make. Now, the progressive era didn't have a unified movement, okay? Each different progressive had their own ideas on what should change. So, people that wanted the economic reform, all right? These people wanted to address the issues that came with capitalism. They wanted to get rid of shady business practices, limit the power of monopolies. Again, we know from last couple weeks that monopolies would raise up prices, would give bad products, would pay low wages. Right? So these folks feel like it's the big businesses that are causing our problems with society, and we need to limit them. All right, social reform. These are people who are trying to address poverty. They were not necessarily as worried about making laws as really trying to actually go and help individual people who are struggling. So what happens, there's a lot of organizations such as the YMCA that develops in order to aid immigrants and the poor. They create settlement houses, which are these community centers. And there's also an increase in mandatory education, which you should be reading about tonight. People who are trying to form the morals of our country. These were people who were very religious, and they felt like, okay, we can take the ideas of religion and we can solve these problems in our country. So the biggest push was for prohibition. Right? What prohibition means is that it's the banning of alcohol. They believe that alcohol was to blame for society's troubles, and that because people were spending their money on alcohol and it wasn't helping them advance in their jobs, that's the reason why people were poor. So these folks fight to actually have alcohol banned, and they're able to do that with the passage of the 18th Amendment, which banned alcohol. And then lastly, people from political reform. All right, this was where we see the largest amount of change during the progressive era. People tried to change the corrupt government that was being run by political machines. So a couple things they do. They get initiatives, referendums, and recalls. Those should be in your notes from yesterday. What these are is it gives people the power to get issues on the ballot. It also gives people the power to recall politicians, to get rid of politicians if they vote enough. Also very important, the 17th Amendment is passed. This leads to the direct election of senators. Before this 17th Amendment, the state governments got to pick who became their two senators from each state. The problem being that the two senators were often picked by political machines because political machines ran our government. So what progressives passed the 17th Amendment, which allows the people to vote for senators, meaning that the senators have to try to win over the people. Instead of having to win over political machines, they actually have to try to do things that help us out. Now, these reforms were aided by a group of people called the Muckrakers. And yes, their name is like raking muck, like raking mud. All right? And what Muckrakers were journalists who tried to expose the bad parts of society. So they would write books and newspapers and magazine articles which showed all these terrible, terrible things that were going on in our country. They exposed corruption. They exposed conditions in factories. They exposed what life was like for poor people in our country. This woke many people up to what our life for our poor was like in our country and started the process to enact legislation to address these issues. Often, the first time people are hearing about these things are through the muckrakers. We don't have Twitter, we don't have Snapchat, we don't have Instagram at this time. People are not seeing what's going on until someone goes and writes about it or takes pictures of it. So for many of this is very shocking news to see what life in a factory was like, or what our poor lived like from Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives. Right? Now, often these muckrakers were not the most unbiased of journalists. They had a very specific agenda, and they intentionally went after certain companies in order to limit and attack those companies and those corporations. So, some three important muckrakers. We've actually learned about one of them already, Jacob Riis, the man who wrote How the Other Half Lives, that you wrote a story on some of his pictures. He is a muckraker. So he took pictures of people in poverty in New York City in tenement houses and wrote a book about it, right, to show how awful the conditions in New York City were. The most famous of muckrakers, though, is Upton Sinclair. And what Upton Sinclair writes is a book called The Jungle. Now, this is not a book about an actual jungle, but rather a book about what the meat packing factories were like. So, when you buy meat, okay, these are the factories that process it. Now, what he did, he wrote in horrific detail about some of the really nasty, gross, disgusting, unsanitary practices and things that these companies were putting in our food. His famous quote, I believe, is something along the lines of, he went out trying to change America's heart, but really he scared their stomach. Right? So he writes about all these horrible things that are going into our food, and people wake up and go, wait a minute, how can factories do this? Why is there no one here to protect us from this? This is really messed up. And they start calling on changes from the government. We will read in class a little bit of The Jungle. It is one of the most famous books of all time in American history and leads to a huge amount of change, which we'll learn about when we get to Teddy Roosevelt. Lastly, Ida Tarbell. She was a person who wrote a history of the Standard Oil Company, which was the Rockefeller Company. And she wrote about and attacked Rockefeller and how he drove up prices and how he treated his workers and really just was a bad person in general. I like this image down here at the bottom. You'll see there's these muckrakers who are literally raking up a guy who's corruption. These were people who were going out intentionally trying to find corruption and root it out. They're kind of gotcha journalists. They're going to pick the worst things and they're going to write about it. Sometimes they're going to be really dramatic about it. So that was a quick little lesson over the Progressive era. The only new material there was the muckrakers. But if that is something that you want to write down, I would go back and look at these 4 areas of reform. And I hope that this worked. Have a nice day. Bye.